Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that still smells faintly like peeling paint and cheap floor polish. I'm sitting in the echo of memory, where the hum of the refrigerator in my parents' house was louder than their voices when they told me I was no longer welcome. It wasn't a dramatic movie slap or an angry explosion, just the quiet, deliberate folding shut of a family door. You'd think rejection would be a thunderstorm, but mine came as still air that made the clock ticks sound unbearable. You probably wouldn't survive that kind of silence. I barely did, and I was the one sitting right there, trying not to blink too hard in case it counted as disrespect. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. I always imagine some of you under morning sunlight while others are tucked away at 2 a.m., headphones on, trying not to wake the cat. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. I remember gripping the edge of the old sofa, the upholstery frayed in places like my confidence. My father leaned against the doorframe with arms crossed, a pose straight out of a stern father catalogue. My mother wouldn't look at me directly. Instead, her eyes drifted to the crucifix above the television, as if Christ might give her lines to say. I had just told them I wanted to dedicate my life to painting, not as a hobby, not as a weekend pastime, but as the very oxygen of my existence. Their response? A swift, icy decree. If you walk that path, you walk it alone. That night, the hallway smelled of bleach and boiled cabbage, mundane scents that welded themselves into the memory. I carried a single duffel bag with brushes sticking out like awkward antennae, and as I stepped into the night, I felt like a character from one of those tragic indie films where the protagonist forgets an umbrella just as it starts to rain. Spoiler, it didn't rain. That might have made things cinematic. Instead, the street was dry, the sky blank, and my shoes squeaked embarrassingly with each step. People think dramatic disownment must come with screaming. Nope. Mine came with the sound of my mother folding laundry in the background. That's the sound that accompanied the death of my place at the family table, socks being stacked. Isn't that absurd? Historians still debate whether ordinary chores should be allowed to soundtrack life's most pivotal tragedies. I kept walking. The night air was crisp, the street lamps flickering like they were also unsure of themselves. I remember thinking, if this were a video game, this would be the tutorial level, learning to manage hunger and loneliness, how to paint on zero budget, how to survive rejection, damage without power-ups. And the thing is, no one tells you that survival sometimes looks like eating day-old bread while trying to smile at strangers who clearly want your sketches. But right then, as my duffel bag dug into my shoulder, I had nothing but the stubborn rhythm of my own footsteps. I told myself, maybe the silence left behind by my family could become a blank canvas. Maybe rejection could be painted over. You ever notice how walls with bad paint jobs almost beg to be covered with murals? That was me, patched, uneven, craving color. I checked my pockets that night. 2 coins, enough for bus fare. But I walked anyway. I wanted to feel the pavement, the grit, the gum stuck to sidewalks, because that was realer than anything I'd just heard inside the house. And walking gave me time to rehearse jokes in my head, because if I didn't laugh, I'd cry. One of them went like this: what's the difference between me and a starving artist? Nothing, except my parents didn't even bother to call me starving, just useless. The apartment I ended up in wasn't even mine. A friend lent me his couch, the cushions dipping like they were trying to swallow me whole. That first night alone, I pulled a paintbrush from my bag and held it like a sword. Ridiculous, yes, but also necessary. If you've ever watched kids pretend their broom is a lightsaber, you'll know the strange power of imagination. In that moment, my brush wasn't just a tool, it was proof I hadn't been erased. Lying there, I thought of my father's last words before I left. Art doesn't feed you. Well, technically he was right. I was already hungry. But art was the only thing that gave me the illusion of being alive. And illusions, as you know, can sometimes carry you further than facts. The radiator hissed that night like it was mocking me. I wrapped myself in a thin blanket and thought, This is how myths begin, not with thunder, but with shivers. And maybe one day someone would retell this story in a voice much calmer than mine, pretending it was inevitable. But in that raw moment it felt anything but inevitable. It felt like the floor could give way at any second. Funny thing though, between the radiator hiss, the creaky couch, and the neighbor's dog that barked at imaginary enemies all night, I fell asleep. Not peacefully, not gracefully, but like collapsing into unconsciousness, after fighting too many battles in one day. And in that sleep, my first dream came, a giant canvas stretching across the sky, waiting for me to ruin it with too much color. I woke up to the sound of traffic outside the cracked window, the kind of morning symphony that includes honking, bicycle bells, and someone yelling in a language you don't quite understand, but know is directed at you somehow. My borrowed couch had left a spring imprint across my back, like an avant-garde tattoo. Breakfast wasn't pancakes or bacon. It was a heel of bread, dry enough to double as sandpaper. I chewed it slowly, partly to make it last, and partly because my jaw didn't want to start the day either. You ever notice how hunger sharpens your hearing? Suddenly, I could pick up the drip 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 of the faucet in the kitchen, each drop like a countdown to a meal that wasn't there. That's when I decided, if I was going to starve, at least I'd starve with dignity. So I took the last of my pocket money, and marched myself to the art supply store. Not a grocery store, not a bakery. Paint first, bread later. Brushes don't mold, food does. The clerk raised an eyebrow when I placed a single cheap brush, and one tiny tube of acrylic on the counter, as if he were thinking, that's not enough to paint a masterpiece. Maybe not. But it was enough to paint something, and something is what you cling to when you've got nothing. Back at the couch, I spread out a cardboard box from the alley as my canvas. The smell of stale beer clung to it, but it was flat, and flat is all I needed. I dipped the brush, pulled a stroke across the rough surface, and felt my stomach growl in protest. A duel had begun. Art versus hunger. Spoiler alert. Hunger won round one. To keep myself alive, I picked up odd jobs, washing dishes in a diner, sweeping up hair at a barbershop, handing out flyers for a nightclub I was never allowed inside. The pay, just enough for bread and instant noodles. I'd clock out, smell like grease or hair gel or cigarettes, and then rush home to paint on whatever surface I'd salvaged that day. My hands smelled like dish soap, my jeans like fryer oil, but my canvases, well, they smelled like defiance. It's funny, when you're broke, you learn to notice things rich people probably miss. Like how bread crusts taste sweeter when you haven't eaten all day, or how standing near a bakery vent can feel like a feast for your nose. I'd lean against that vent sometimes, pretending to be deep in thought, when really I was just inhaling croissant fumes like a connoisseur. If any historian stumbles across my life, they might argue endlessly about whether I survived those years through talent, or through the fine art of strategic sniffing. Every shift at the diner I'd steal glances at the ketchup smears on plates, and think, that could be a sunset, the foamy beer residue on glasses, ocean waves, even the hair clumps at the barber shop swirled like storm clouds. I know, gross, but art is like that, finding the sublime in what makes other people wrinkle their noses. And sometimes, the jokes wrote themselves. I'd tell coworkers, don't worry, I won't sketch you unless you tip me. They laughed nervously. I wasn't joking. Nights were the hardest. My stomach grumbled like an old washing machine. The radiator hissed, and the couch springs poked at me like they were keeping score. I'd whisper to myself, one day these paintings will buy me a bed that doesn't bite back. That kind of delusion is what gets you through. There was this one time I found half a sandwich in the diner trash, perfectly wrapped. My pride hesitated, but my hunger didn't. I ate it, and as I chewed, I thought, maybe one day I'll paint this moment, title it Portrait of Desperation with Mustard, and hang it in a gallery just to watch people nod seriously as if it were profound. Joke's on them. It was profound, to me, at least. I remember counting coins late at night, the clink of metal echoing like a cruel percussion instrument. Every coin was a choice, food or more paint. Most nights, paint won, which makes no sense. Paint doesn't keep you alive. Or maybe it does, just not in the traditional calories and vitamins way. One evening, after a particularly long shift at the barber shop, I sat down to draw on the back of a pizza box. The smell of cheese lingered faintly, almost taunting me. But as I sketched lines forming faces and shadows, I forgot my hunger for a while. That's the magic. Your stomach might be empty, but your soul gets fed. And between you and me, soul food beats fast food any day. A neighbor once peeked into the apartment, saw my cardboard canvases leaning against the wall and said, "That's garbage." I smiled. Exactly, because isn't art just garbage we convince ourselves to look at longer? They rolled their eyes. I kept painting. Those months felt endless, like time itself was stuck in traffic. I learned to mix cheap paints like a bartender mixes drinks, stretching one color into 5, inventing shades no one could name. My brushes frayed, my clothes smelled perpetually of fryer oil, and my landlord glared every time rent was late. But in the quiet hours, when the city finally stopped honking, and the dog upstairs gave up barking, I painted. Looking back, I realized that was survival, not glamorous, not Instagram-worthy, just stubbornness on repeat. The kind of stubbornness that teaches you how to live off bread crusts and still dream of feasts. The kind of stubbornness that makes you laugh at your own misery, because if you don't laugh, you choke on it. And maybe that's the punchline of this chapter of my life. I didn't paint to escape hunger. I painted to make hunger sit down and shut up, even for a few hours. The nights stretched long in that sagging little apartment, and sometimes I felt like I lived inside a clock that had forgotten how to tick properly. Silence pressed against the walls, heavy enough that I could hear every drip from the faucet, every shuffle from the neighbor upstairs, and even the faint buzz of the fluorescent light outside my window. If loneliness had a soundtrack, it would be that faint hum, paired with the creak of pipes like an old man's joints. That's when painting became less of an ambition and more of a survival instinct. By day I was a dish sponge, a broom, a flyer dispenser. By night I was a smuggler of colors, sneaking them onto cardboard, old wood panels, even paper bags from the grocery store. I painted in silence, because noise felt like a betrayal. My brush whispered against surfaces like it was gossiping secrets only I was meant to hear. You know that feeling when you're up at 2 a.m., scrolling your phone, and suddenly you realize you're the only person awake in the entire apartment building? That's what painting felt like back then, except I didn't have a phone that could scroll. I had a brush that traced little rebellions in blue and gray. Sometimes, though, silence wasn't peaceful, it was mocking. There was one night the pipes above me groaned so loud, I thought the ceiling would collapse. I laughed at myself, thinking, imagine surviving parental exile only to be killed by plumbing. A tragic end, sure, but at least the newspapers would have a quirky headline. I painted faces, mostly, faces of people I saw briefly on the street, faces from memories I wished I could forget, even faces I invented. They weren't pretty, not in the traditional sense. Their eyes always looked too tired, their mouths too tight. Someone once told me my early paintings looked like sad passport photos. I took it as a compliment. My friend, the one who lent me his couch, would sometimes watch me paint. He'd shake his head and say, "Man, you could be out with us, meeting people, having fun." Fun, what a strange word when your fridge contained only a jar of pickles and a half-empty bottle of ketchup. I'd reply, painting is my nightlife. At least my hangovers are made of color, not regret. But here's the thing, those nights, I didn't feel like I was failing. I felt like I was suspended, as if the world had paused just long enough for me to build a secret foundation no one else could see. Historians still argue about whether silence is fertile ground or barren wasteland. For me, it was both. Some nights I bloomed, other nights I withered. One of the strangest comforts was the flickering street lamp outside. It pulsed like it was breathing, and sometimes I painted to its rhythm. That light became my unreliable studio assistant. When it dimmed, I cursed it. When it blazed, I thanked it. Once, it stayed out for 3 nights, and I nearly lost my mind painting in the dark, using touch more than sight. My hands stained with paint, I imagined myself as some blind monk, trying to capture visions no one else believed in. I can still recall the smell, acrylic mixing with mildew, paint thinner mingling with leftover ramen seasoning packets. My fingers cracked from washing dishes all day, so gripping a brush felt like holding a weapon I wasn't strong enough for. And yet, the moment the bristles touched surface, the pain blurred. You know how athletes talk about a runner's high? I had a painter's high, minus the medals, plus the hunger pangs. I joked with myself often, out loud, because silence answers back if you let it linger too long. I'd say things like, well, at least paint doesn't spoil like milk, or, if this brush frays anymore, I'll give it a haircut. One night I laughed so hard at my own joke about brushes needing therapy that the dog upstairs started barking, as if to tell me to keep it down. Even my humor had thin walls, but amid the jokes and exhaustion, there was a quiet clarity. I was becoming myself, piece by piece, stroke by stroke, silence by silence. And when I finally stepped back from one particular cardboard painting, a girl sitting in the middle of an empty street, her hair tangled like telephone wires, I felt something close to awe, not because it was good, but because it was honest. I tacked it up on the wall, crooked and uneven, but it stayed there like a flag declaring, I'm still here. Funny how those small victories carried me through. When hunger knocked, when silence jeered, when exhaustion dragged me under, that painting was my rebuttal. My proof that I wasn't just surviving nights of cardboard canvases, I was building a gallery in secret. And maybe that's what those quiet nights really were. Rehearsals, not for applause or money, but for me, learning to exist without anyone else's permission. Criticism arrives in many forms. Sometimes it's a raised eyebrow, sometimes it's silence, and sometimes it's a full-on roast served cold. My first official critique came from a local Archie appreciator, which is basically a polite way of saying guy who hangs around galleries because he likes free wine. He looked at one of my cardboard pieces, tilted his head as if checking for hidden messages, and said, it's interesting. The word people use when they don't want to say bad. It stung, sure, but also made me laugh. If I had $1 for every time someone called me interesting, I wouldn't have needed to eat crusts of bread. Interesting is like the shrug emoji of language. It says nothing while pretending to say everything. That wasn't the only review. A woman at a flea market once stopped at my makeshift stall, really just a blanket on the ground, and told me my work looked like accidents that never cleaned up. She smiled, thinking it was helpful feedback. I smiled back, thinking she must have spilled something important once and never forgiven herself. Criticism is weird. It can crush you or energize you, sometimes both in the same breath. I'd walk away muttering sarcastically, like, oh, thank you, ma'am. I'll put accidental mess on my resume right next to starving. That humor wasn't bitterness, it was armor. If I didn't laugh, I'd collapse under the weight of every disapproving glance. The truth, my paintings were messy. Paint bled into corners, brush hairs stuck to surfaces, cardboard bent at awkward angles. But that was me. Bent, awkward, bleeding into corners. I wasn't trying to be polished. I was trying to be alive. Still, each comment lodged in my brain like popcorn kernels in teeth. At night, lying on the couch with its springs plotting mutiny, I'd replay the voices. It's interesting, it looks like an accident. And then my own voice would whisper, maybe they're right. Doubt is the most loyal critic. It shows up uninvited and never leaves. One night, I sat staring at a half-finished painting of a man with no eyes. The brush dangled in my hand, heavy as guilt. I thought about throwing it down, giving up, finding a real job my parents would have approved of, maybe accounting, maybe selling insurance. But then the radiator hissed, the faucet dripped, and I realized, those sounds would follow me anywhere. Doubt follows everywhere. At least here, with paint on my fingers, I could answer back. So I kept going. I told myself that even if my work was ugly, it was mine. Like bad karaoke, it doesn't matter if it's off-key. It matters that you sang it. And if you've ever been in a karaoke bar at 2 a.m., you know the off-key singers are the ones who pour their souls out. The polished ones, forgettable. Of course, some critiques were unintentionally hilarious. A passerby once asked if one of my paintings was meant to be upside down. I hadn't noticed it was upside down. I smiled and said, it's abstract. You decide. The secret power of being an artist. Mistakes become choices if you say them confidently enough, but not all criticism came from strangers. My own head was the harshest gallery. I'd look at a finished piece and think, is this art or just therapy I forgot to keep private? Sometimes both, sometimes neither. And in those moments, I'd laugh out loud, startling the neighbor's dog, because really, what kind of idiot paints on trash and calls it a career path? Me, apparently. Here's the twist, though. Every cruel comment, every sarcastic smirk, every interesting muttered under breath, they became fuel. I wanted to prove them wrong. Not in an angry way, but in that quiet, persistent way you keep running on a treadmill even when you hate cardio, just to see if you can make it another mile. And honestly, I owe those critics something. Without them, maybe I'd have settled. Maybe I'd have said, this is good enough. Instead, their words haunted me, pushed me, sharpened me. Historians still debate whether enemies create more greatness than friends. In my case, the jury's still out, but I know for sure, enemies make excellent alarm clocks. I remember standing in front of a particularly vicious review, taped anonymously to one of my pieces at a local community show. It said, "Looks like the artist gave up halfway." I stared at it for a long time, then I laughed, because they weren't wrong. I had given up halfway, and then I picked up the brush again, right after reading that note. Irony, my old friend. So if you're wondering whether criticism kills, here's my answer. It doesn't. It bruises, it irritates, it echoes at 3 a.m., but it doesn't kill. In fact, sometimes it teaches you how to laugh at yourself before anyone else does, and laughter, oddly enough, makes the paint flow smoother. The first time I sold a painting, it felt like tricking the universe. I remember the day perfectly, not because it was glamorous, but because it was laughably ordinary. I had a tiny setup at a community fair, wedged between a booth selling organic honey and another offering handmade dog sweaters. My gallery consisted of 3 paintings propped up on a folding chair and one taped to the side of a cardboard box. People wandered by, glancing with the same level of interest they'd give to free samples of hummus. I didn't mind. By then, I was used to being background noise. My paintings were just another texture in the chaos of weekend leisure. And then it happened. I nearly choked on the lukewarm soda I'd been sipping. My instinct was to say, "For you, free," because surely he wasn't serious. But his wallet was already halfway out, like he'd done this before. My brain scrambled for a number. I thought about my rent, my empty fridge, the noodles waiting for me at home. My mouth blurted out, $200. I expected him to laugh, maybe walk away shaking his head. Instead he nodded, pulled out crisp bills, and handed them over, just like that. No drama, no bargaining, no theatrical sighs. $200 in my hand, and a cardboard canvas in his. I stood there, stunned, like someone had just told me I'd won the lottery by accident. My knees felt weak. I half expected him to change his mind, snatch the money back, and accuse me of fraud. But he just tucked the painting under his arm, and walked off toward the honey stall, as if buying struggling artist art was as casual as picking up groceries. The rest of the day, I couldn't stop grinning. I ate actual food that night. Real food. Not crusts, not ramen, but a hot meal at a diner where I didn't have to sweep the floor after. I even tipped the waitress generously, which felt like a flex. That one sale didn't make me rich, but it rewired my brain. For the first time, I realized, people might actually pay for the way I see the world. That's a dangerous kind of hope, the kind that keeps you awake sketching at 3 a.m. when you should be sleeping. Of course, the jokes came, too. I told a friend, "Guess what? I just sold my art for $200. He raised an eyebrow and said, "Wow, someone must have had too much wine." I laughed, because maybe he was right, but drunk or sober, the man had paid, and that was enough for me. After that, I started to take myself a little more seriously, not in an arrogant way, more like cautiously believing I wasn't completely delusional. I saved scraps of cash to buy small canvases, real ones this time, though I still used cardboard when funds ran out. The smell of fresh canvas was intoxicating, like walking into a new apartment before it's been lived in. Funny thing about success, even in small doses, it makes failure look different. The next time someone scoffed at my work, I thought, well, at least one person disagreed with you enough to pay me $200. That thought was a shield, thin but sturdy enough to deflect a few arrows. I carried that energy into more community fairs, flea markets, even a sketchy cafe where the owner let me hang my art on the walls in exchange for sweeping after hours. People didn't always buy, but sometimes they stared, and staring was the first step. Historians still argue whether the first sale of an artist is more significant than their biggest sale. I lean toward the first, because the biggest one feels like lightning, but the first one, that's the spark that convinces you to stand in the rain with a metal rod in the first place. I still remember that painting clearly. Muted blues, a figure hunched on a bench, rain streaks that looked more like coffee spills than weather. Not my best work, but maybe that's why he bought it. It looked human, flawed, oddly comforting. Or maybe he just had an empty spot on his wall and didn't care what filled it. Doesn't matter. That sale lit a fuse. Suddenly, every brushstroke felt like a gamble I might win. I leaned harder into my late-night sessions, painting until my eyes burned, until the radiator hissed at me to stop. My friends started complaining about the smell of acrylic, but I told him, get used to it. This is the smell of the future. And for once, I wasn't joking. Momentum is a fragile thing. It doesn't roar like thunder, it tiptoes in, disguised as little winds, and if you're not paying attention, you miss it. After that first sale, I started noticing momentum everywhere. In the way people lingered longer at my table. In the way friends who once teased me now asked, so what's your next piece about? Their tone was still mocking, but softer, almost curious. I clung to that curiosity like a life raft. At night, my cramped apartment turned into a battlefield of brushes, paint-streaked rags, and half-finished canvases. The walls became soldiers lined up for inspection, each one bearing scars of trial and error. Some were disasters. I once tried to mix 3 shades of green, and ended up with a color best described as swamp regret. But others had sparks, and those sparks kept me moving. One night I caught myself whispering to a painting, "You might be the one." Like a gambler talking to dice. That's what art felt like then. Rolling dice against the odds. Except the currency was time, sanity, and the hope that someone else's eyes would see what mine couldn't stop seeing. The fairs turned into small shows, the kind hosted in where the lighting was bad, and the coffee worse, but where people actually walked in looking for art. I'll never forget the first time someone asked if my piece was available like I had something people wanted. I resisted the urge to reply, "Are you sure you're not lost?" But the real shift came from a gallery, tiny one, yes, tucked away in a neighborhood most people forgot existed. The owner was a wiry woman with hair that looked like she de-stuck her finger in a socket, but her eyes were sharp, like she could peel the truth off you with a glance. She saw my work at a cafe and said, "You have something raw, come show it here." My first instinct was suspicion. Gallery people didn't talk to people like me, at least, not without charging fees or slipping contracts that read like curses. But she was different. Her space wasn't polished, her chairs wobbled, and her walls had chipped paint. I liked it. It felt honest. When opening night came, I wore my one decent shirt, the one I'd ironed so many times. The fabric looked tired. I stood in the corner while strangers drifted through the gallery, wine glasses in hand, tilting their heads at my paintings. Watching them was torture, and thrill rolled into one. Every raised eyebrow felt like a verdict, every nod like a secret handshake. Then a couple stopped in front of a piece I'd painted during one of my lowest nights. It was all jagged strokes and dark tones, a canvas I almost tossed in the trash. They stared for so long I thought they'd fallen asleep on their feet. Finally, the woman turned to me and said, "It feels like my father's silence." Her words punched the air out of me. I hadn't painted it with her father in mind. I'd painted it with my own loneliness clawing at me. But somehow she found her story in mine. And that's when I realized, art isn't just about me screaming into a void. It's about the echo that comes back. They bought the piece. Not for $200 this time, for $1,500. $1,500. My hand shook as I wrote out the receipt, the numbers looking alien on paper. When they left, I ducked into the back room, leaned against the wall, and laughed until tears blurred my vision. 1,500, that was rent, groceries, and the sweet luxury of not having to choose between paint and dinner for once. Of course, the money wasn't the only thing. What mattered more was the validation. Someone had not only seen me, but invested in what they saw. It was like being told, yes, you belong here. Yes, this madness means something. From there, word began to spread, not like wildfire, but like embers catching in dry grass. Small collectors asked about me, others wanted to hang my work. The wiry gallery owner invited me to another show, then another. Each time I walked in pretending not to care, but inside I was buzzing, praying someone would stop in front of my canvas and tilt their head just so. And yet, even as momentum grew, the shadow of my family's rejection loomed. I imagined them hearing about my tiny victories and scoffing. So what? A few paintings sold. She's still wasting her life. Maybe they were right. I wasn't rich, not yet. My bank account still gave me anxiety. But I'd tasted something they could never take back. Proof. Proof that my art had value beyond the walls of our old house, and beyond their silence. And once you taste proof, you get greedy for more. The thing about momentum is that it doesn't ask if you're ready. It drags you along whether your shoes are tied or not. Suddenly, I found myself saying yes to opportunities that terrified me. A group show downtown. A live painting event at some trendy rooftop where people sipped overpriced cocktails while pretending to understand brush. I'd stand there, sweat pooling under my collar, trying not to look like the broke imposter I felt like. Funny thing though, people bought it. Not just the paintings, but me, the whole struggling artist performance. It was like watching a character I invented step off the page and charm the crowd. Inside I was still the girl who cried over rejection letters. Outside, I became the emerging artist with a raw edge. Please. If they'd seen me that morning hunched over instant noodles, they'd have called me the emerging artist with bad sodium habits. Still, the buzz grew. My name started showing up in emails, on flyers, even whispered in conversations I wasn't part of. That whisper was intoxicating. Imagine hearing your name float across a room where you're a nobody. It's like stumbling upon your song playing on the radio for the first time. And then came the collectors. Collectors are a strange species. They circle like cats, never committing too soon. They'll stroke their chins, ask obscure questions, and make you feel like your entire soul is under auction. But when they decide, oh, it's like being knighted. The first one to discover me was a man in a linen suit with sandals, the kind of guy who looked allergic to socks. He walked straight up to a canvas I nearly didn't bring, because I thought it was too weird, all angles and unsettling colors. He tapped the frame lightly, as though checking for a heartbeat, and said, "I'll take it." Just like that. No hesitation. I almost asked if he'd mistaken me for someone else. When he handed me the check, I had to stop myself from kissing it. Not him, the check, though in that moment, the two were interchangeable. With every piece sold, a door cracked open. Invitations followed. Small galleries, art walks, private showings and apartments that smelled faintly of wealth and white wine. I learned quickly that in this world, half of survival is nodding like you understand references to postmodern blah blah blah. The other half is remembering people's names. Spoiler, I was bad at both. But I had something better. The work. And the work began to shift. No longer was I painting just to survive, or to exercise loneliness. I painted knowing someone might connect with it. That knowledge was fuel, and fear combined. It made me meticulous, but also reckless. Some nights I'd destroy 3 canvases in frustration. Other nights I'd finish something in one feverish sprint, like the painting had been waiting for me to catch up. Of course, the higher you climb, the sharper the drop looks. My bank account improved, sure, but it wasn't overflowing. Rent was still a monster hiding under the bed. I still bought discount ramen in bulk. Yet every once in a while I'd splurge on good brushes, on a bottle of wine not sold in a plastic jug. Those small luxuries felt bigger than any paycheck from a safe career could have. I'd walk home late at night after shows, the city humming with neon, and strangers. And I'd whisper to myself, this is working. Not perfect, not secure, but working. And that was enough to keep going. Of course, I couldn't help but imagine my parents, if they saw it, would they soften? Would my mother's eyes widen in that way they used to when I showed her a good grade? Would my father finally say something other than waste when he thought of me? Probably not. Not yet. Maybe never. But the fantasy lingered, tucked away like an unopened letter. One night after a show, a fellow artist leaned in and said, "Enjoy this moment. The first real taste of recognition only comes once." He was right. Recognition is like first love. Awkward, exhilarating, terrifying. You don't forget the way it makes your heart trip over itself. And just like first love, you start craving the next. Recognition is a peculiar drug. It doesn't numb you. It sharpens everything. Suddenly, the clinking of glasses at a gallery opening sounded like applause meant for me. Even the way strangers leaned in closer to my canvases felt like a secret confirmation that I was no longer invisible. But like all drugs, it came with a side effect. Paranoia. Was I a fluke? A novelty? Would they forget me tomorrow? These questions stalked me late at night, louder than the hum of the old fridge in my apartment. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, thinking of artists who had burned bright only to vanish into obscurity. A cruel game of musical chairs where history decides who keeps their seat. Still, doubt didn't stop me from chasing the next show, and the next. I said yes to everything, partly out of hunger, partly out of fear that if I paused, the momentum would evaporate. My calendar, once empty enough to make me feel like an abandoned bus stop, now filled with scribbles. Studio visit at 3, opening at 7, coffee with gallery owner at 10. The bus stop had turned into Grand Central overnight. Then came the critics. The first time I saw my name in print, I nearly dropped the newspaper into my coffee. It wasn't the Times, relax, more like a local arts magazine that probably doubled as birdcage lining in some households. Still, there it was. My name, spelled correctly, next to a photograph of one of my paintings. The critic called my work unpolished but evocative, raw in a way that both unsettles and captivates. Unpolished but evocative. I clung to those words as if they were medals. Never mind the part where they added, the artist occasionally leans into melodrama. Hey, melodrama sells, right? I cut the article out and taped it to my wall, right next to my unpaid electricity bill. Nothing says emerging artists like juxtaposing validation with overdue notices. But criticism also brought pressure. Every show felt heavier. Every blank canvas stared back at me, whispering, "Prove yourself again." I painted until my hands cramped, until I smelled turpentine in my dreams. The work grew bolder, angrier, sometimes softer in ways I didn't expect. I wasn't just painting for me anymore, I was painting for them, whoever them was. At one show, a woman in pearls approached me and said, "Your work reminds me of when I was 20, terrified but hopeful." I wanted to laugh. If pearls were her accessory of choice, she'd probably never had to eat ramen for breakfast. But the truth in her eyes stopped me. She wasn't buying a canvas. She was buying her own reflection. That is, when I realized something uncomfortable. I was no longer the sole narrator of my art. Viewers rewrote the story every time they looked. And honestly, I liked that. Sales trickled in more steadily, though steady is a generous word. It was like living off tips from a bartender job where sometimes customers paid in monopoly money. Still, each sale stretched the rope I was walking on a little farther. Of course, the shadow of my family lingered. I kept wondering if word had reached them. Did a cousin mention seeing my name in a flyer? Did a neighbor whisper about the girl who finally did something with her weird drawings? I pictured my father scoffing, my mother sighing, maybe both shaking their heads, but deep down, I hoped. That hope was stubborn, like a plant growing in a crack of cement. Some historians still argue. I remember thinking one night as I packed up after another modestly successful show, whether recognition comes from talent or timing. Personally, I thought it was both, and maybe just a bit of luck, like showing up at the right bus stop before it's demolished. The bus stop metaphor again, it haunted me. Maybe because, for the first time, I didn't feel abandoned there anymore. I felt like the bus had finally arrived. The real question, Where was it taking me? Success doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It sneaks in through side doors and suddenly rearranges your furniture. One moment I was hustling from one low-lit gallery to another. The next, an email landed in my inbox with a subject line that made me choke on my coffee. Invitation to international exhibition. At first I thought it was spam, probably some scammer asking me to ship a painting to a prince who just happened to have a gallery in his palace. But no, it was real. A mid-size international art fair, known for being a launchpad for artists who went from emerging to how much for that piece. Oh, add another zero. I read the email 5 times, then 6, waiting for the words to vanish. They didn't. Instead, my stomach turned flips, half joy, half dread. Because here's the thing, opportunity is thrilling, but it's also terrifying. Suddenly, all the doubts I'd shoved into corners came out to party. Am I good enough? Will anyone there care? What if my work looks amateur next to theirs? But saying no wasn't an option. I hit reply with shaky fingers. Yes, I'd be honored. And just like that, the countdown began. The weeks leading up to the fair were chaos. My apartment transformed into a disaster zone of half-done canvases, empty coffee cups, and sticky notes with cryptic phrases like light through cracked glass, an angry horizon. I worked until dawn most nights, my hands stained with paint, my back aching, my heart racing. Every brushstroke felt heavier, like it carried not just my story, but the weight of everything I'd been told I couldn't do. To distract myself, I researched the fair online. Pictures of past years showed crowds in sharp suits, heels clicking on polished floors, champagne flutes balanced with ease. Collectors, critics, influencers, basically, sharks in designer clothing. And me, I was still the girl who patched jeans with duct tape once. The flight itself was surreal. I'd barely left my city before, and now I was dragging a carefully packed crate of paintings through airport security while an officer asked suspiciously, "What's in here?" I wanted to say, "My entire future," but settled on artwork instead. Landing in a foreign city felt like stepping into a movie where I wasn't sure of my role. Everything was glossy. Billboards, storefronts, even the sidewalks seemed to shine. I remember rolling my suitcase past boutique windows filled with clothes worth more than my rent, and thinking, what am I doing here? The exhibition hall was massive, buzzing with voices in a dozen languages, the air humming with money and ambition. My little booth felt like a lifeboat in a storm, walls freshly painted white, my canvases carefully hung. I stood there, trying to look confident, though my hands kept fidgeting behind my back. Then the people came, first in trickles, then in steady streams. They stopped, tilted their heads, whispered to each other. Some walked on quickly, dagger to the heart every time, but others lingered. A woman with scarlet lipstick murmured haunting. A man in a tailored suit asked about my process, nodding thoughtfully as if I'd revealed state secrets. By the second day, a critic approached with a notebook, scribbling furiously while circling one of my darker pieces. He muttered something about modern expressions of isolation, and I thought, sure, let's go with that, even though I'd painted it on a night when my fridge contained nothing but ketchup packets. And then, it happened. A collector, tall, sharp, the kind who looked like they could afford to buy the entire booth next to mine, pointed at one of my paintings and said, "I want this. The price 6 figures. 6 figures. I tried to nod calmly, like this was normal, while my brain screamed, "This is more money than I've ever seen in my life." We signed papers. They handed me a check that felt heavier than any object I'd ever held. I excused myself to the restroom and sat in a stall, laughing until I nearly cried. That was the moment the one artists dream about while eating stale bread. The one my family swore would never come. And all I could think was, wait until they hear about this. If Section 9 was the storm's peak, then this was the thunder that followed. The kind that shakes the windows and makes you realize something irreversible has shifted. That 6-figure sale wasn't just money. It was validation signed in ink, notarized by a collector who didn't even blink at the price tag. For days, I floated through the fair like someone had swapped my shoes with rocket boosters. Every conversation seemed easier, every smile more genuine. People who hadn't looked twice at me on day one now lingered at my booth, their eyes sharp, calculating. ID gone from that kid with raw edges to the artist you should keep an eye on. Strange how fast people rewrite your story once they smell success. But beneath the thrill was a deeper current. The ghosts of home, my parents, their voices, their silence. Every compliment I received seemed to ricochet back into the memory of our kitchen table, where my father's words once carved into me. You'll regret wasting your life on this nonsense. I wanted to scream across continents and years. Are you watching now? Still nonsense. Instead, I smiled politely, shook hands, exchanged business cards like I was supposed to. Professional.com. Meanwhile, inside, I was staging a victory parade, complete with marching bands and confetti cannons. By the end of the fair, more paintings sold, not all for six figures, let's not get greedy, but enough to cover years of rent, groceries, and the kind of brushes I used to only stare at in shop windows. I even allowed myself a ridiculous splurge, a hotel upgrade for the last night. Picture me, sprawled across crisp white sheets in a room, with a skyline view, eating overpriced room service pasta while whispering to myself, I made it out. On the flight home, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the fair in my head, each handshake, each nod of approval, each flash of the camera in front of my work. I thought of the critics, the collectors, even the skeptics, all orbiting around the thing I once did alone in a cramped apartment. The thought made my chest ache in a way that wasn't quite pain. It was recognition of the distance traveled. Landing back in my city felt surreal. The same cracked sidewalks, the same corner store with flickering neon, the same bus screeching past. And yet, I wasn't the same person who had boarded that flight. My suitcase was heavier with unsold pieces, but my heart was heavier with proof. I didn't call my parents right away, partly out of stubbornness, partly out of fear. What if even this wasn't enough for them? What if I told them, and they dismissed it with a shrug? No, I decided, let them hear it from someone else. Let the news trickle back through whispers, through neighbors, through that cousin who always snooped too much. I wanted the story to reach them not as a confession from me, but as a fact they couldn't deny. In the meantime, I returned to my studio, only it didn't feel the same anymore. The walls were still cracked, the air still smelled faintly of turpentine, but the space seemed bigger, somehow, like the world outside had finally acknowledged what was happening inside these four walls. I painted with a new energy, bolder strokes, brighter contrasts. I wasn't just trying to prove something anymore. I was building a body of work that would stand taller than the doubts, taller than the rejections, taller than even my parents' disapproval. And every brushstroke whispered the same quiet, relentless phrase, they were wrong. Historians still argue, I mused one night while rinsing brushes, whether success is the best revenge, or whether silence cuts deeper. Personally, I was leaning toward success, with just a hint of salt in the wound, because as much as I pretended otherwise, revenge was on my mind. Not cruel, not violent, just the sweet, undeniable revenge of thriving where I was told I'd wither. And oh, I wasn't done yet, not even close. Coming back from that international fair was like returning from a dream where you'd been flying, only to find yourself standing barefoot on the same creaky floorboards you'd always known. Except this time, the floorboards didn't groan as loudly. Or maybe I didn't care anymore, because something had shifted. Not just in my career, but in the way people looked at me. Acquaintances who used to say, "Oh, you're still doing that art thing," now approached me with a different tone. "I've been following your journey. It's so inspiring." Inspiring, what a funny word. As if I'd been living on mountaintops, with enlightenment instead of scraping rent money together, with paint under my fingernails. Still, I let them say it. I even smiled. The real test came when I opened my email one afternoon, and saw a name I hadn't seen in years, my mother's. The subject line was as plain as could be. Call us. I froze. The cursor blinked on the screen, impatient. My chest tightened the way it used to, when I'd walk into our living room as a teenager, my sketchbook hidden behind my back. Did they finally know? Had the whispers reached them, or was this some cruel twist where they needed something, and thought, after all this time, that I'd just come running. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I went for a walk. The city was buzzing, the sidewalk sticky with late summer heat, and I needed the chaos of traffic to drown out my thoughts. When I finally dialed the number that night, my hands shook. My father answered, his voice the same gravelly sound etched into my memory. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then, blunt as always, he said, "We saw the article." Article. Turns out a major newspaper had run a feature about the international fair, complete with a photograph of me standing awkwardly next to my sold canvas. There I was, half-smile, paint-splattered jeans, a caption that read, "Young artist stuns international collectors with bold, visceral work." They'd seen it. They couldn't avoid it. So, my father continued, "You've done well." The words came out like gravel being shoveled. It should have been satisfying. It should have been enough. But instead of triumph, I felt a hollow ache. Years of silence, rejection, dismissal, now boiled down to a grudging acknowledgement. That was it. My mother came on the line next. Her voice was softer, hesitant. "We're proud of you," she said, though the words wobbled like a chair with a missing leg. Part of me wanted to snap. Where was this pride when I needed it? But another part, smaller, quieter, just wanted to hear it, even if it was late, even if it was imperfect. I didn't forgive them. Not fully, not instantly. Forgiveness isn't a switch. It's more like sanding down rough edges. But I did let the words sit with me. I let myself breathe them in, like a perfume I wasn't sure I liked but couldn't ignore. After the call, I sat in my studio surrounded by canvases and silence. I thought about revenge, success, pride, and pain, all swirling together in messy colors. And I realized something. I hadn't been chasing money, or fame, or even their acknowledgement. Not really. What I'd been chasing all along was the freedom to define myself, without their permission. Now I had it, and yet, the child in me still whispered, "See me, love me, tell me I was never wrong." Historians still argue, I muttered to myself with a half-smile, whether parents ever truly see their children as adults, or if they're forever trapped in old versions of them. I suspected it was the latter. But either way, I wasn't trapped anymore. The call with my parents replayed in my head for weeks, like a song stuck on a scratchy loop. "We're proud of you," my mother's voice said in the dark, again and again, until the words lost all shape and became just sound. Did she mean it? Or was it an obligatory phrase, the kind you toss like loose change when you feel guilty for not paying the full bill? Either way, something in me had cracked. Not broken, but shifted, like a window finally pried open after years of rust. The air felt different. Meanwhile, my world outside family kept accelerating. Collectors wanted to be on my waiting list, which still felt absurd enough to make me giggle in private. My inbox filled with gallery offers, invitations to panels, even requests for interviews. I once had to Google myself just to remember which outlet had published what. Yes, I admit it, I vanity searched. Don't pretend you wouldn't, but with success came logistics. A word artists pretend doesn't exist until it bites them. Taxes, contracts, insurance, shipping crates that cost more than my first car. I had to hire a manager. Someone who wore glasses sharp enough to slice through bad deals. She handled the numbers while I tried not to faint every time I saw them. And oh, the numbers. Paintings that once sold for rent money now went for more than an entire year's rent. It was dizzying. I caught myself one night staring at my bank balance, whispering, "Is this me?" The girl who once dug for coins in couch cushions now had commas where there used to be overdraft warnings. Naturally, success attracted relatives I hadn't heard from in a decade. Aunts who once tutted, "She'll never make it," suddenly remembered my phone number. Cousins popped up in my DMEs, all smiley emojis, and thinly veiled curiosity about opportunities. The hypocrisy was so blatant I almost admired it. And then there were my parents. After the phone call, they began reaching out more. Short messages at first. "Saw your feature. Congrats on the show." Always stiff. As if the words were wearing ironed shirts. Once, my father even asked, "How's the work going?" I nearly fainted. But here's the kicker. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to fling open the door, to let them back in and bask in their late-arriving approval. Another part wanted to slam the door and deadbolt it, whispering, "Too late. You don't get to enjoy this harvest when you scorched the soil." So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I painted it. One canvas, massive, nearly as tall as me. The background was stormy gray, layered with strokes that looked like cracks. In the center, I painted a figure, half-formed, reaching outward, but surrounded by walls of silence. I titled it Inheritance. When it debuted at a show, people stood in front of it for long minutes, silent. One critic called it a raw exploration of generational wounds. Another collector offered a staggering sum before the paint had fully dried. I accepted, but not for the money, because it proved something. Even my deepest pain had currency, had meaning beyond me. That night, alone in the studio, I sat on the floor staring at the empty wall where Inheritance had hung hours earlier. I felt lighter, as if I'd exorcised something that had lived in me for too long. Some historians still argue, I whispered into the quiet, whether art heals the wound or simply documents it. I didn't have the answer, but I knew this much: the wound was finally seen. The next year became a blur of airports, hotel rooms, and gallery lights that seemed too bright for my jet-lagged eyes. I was suddenly what they called internationally collected, a phrase that sounded like I was a stamp or a rare coin. I smiled through endless receptions, clinking glasses with strangers who insisted we were friends because they owned a square of my soul hanging in their living room. And still, the family question hovered like fog. I carried them with me everywhere, like invisible luggage I never checked. In Tokyo, I thought of how my mother once joked that I'd end up painting cartoons on alley walls. In Paris, while cameras flashed, I remembered my father's voice saying, "This isn't a profession, it's a hobby." In New York, surrounded by admirers, I felt like a child again, standing in the doorway of their rejection. The irony of my success was sharp enough to cut. Every article, every collector's nod, every sold-out show only highlighted the absence of my parents in the front row. Their silence echoed louder than the applause. Then came the invitation to headline at Basel, the pinnacle, the Everest of the art world. My name printed on banners, my work catalogued alongside giants. I should have been elated, and I was, but threaded through the triumph was a restless ache. I found myself scanning every crowd, every champagne reception, as if they might appear unannounced, contrite, ready to say, "We were wrong." Spoiler, they never did. Instead, what I got was a neatly typed letter. Yes, a letter, as if we were in the 19th century. The handwriting on the envelope was my father's, though the words inside were stiffly neutral. "We see you are doing well. Your mother and I are glad. Perhaps we might talk again when convenient." I read it 3 times. Glad, perhaps convenient. The words were clinical, like a doctor's note excusing me from gym class. I laughed until I cried. That night, I stood on my hotel balcony, city lights flickering below, and thought, so this is it. This is reconciliation. Not fireworks, not tears, not some cinematic embrace. Just a cautious line thrown across decades of silence. I could have ignored it. I could have burned it. Instead, I placed it carefully in my sketchbook, between pages smudged with charcoal. Because here's the thing, I realized I didn't need their applause anymore. I had audiences, collectors, critics, and strangers who saw me, truly saw me, in colors and strokes. But the child in me still longed for something small, something unremarkable. To hear my parents say, without hesitation, "We're proud, and we're sorry," they hadn't yet. Maybe they never would. So I kept painting. My work turned sharper, louder, braver. I wasn't the rejected daughter anymore. I was the historian of rejection, documenting how it shapes, twists, and sometimes fuels us. In Basel, under spotlights, I whispered to myself, some historians argue whether success erases the wound. I can tell you, it doesn't. It only gilds the scar. And when applause thundered around me, I clapped too, softly, for myself. Basel closed, the critics wrote their rhapsodies, and my bank account started looking like a math problem no one in my family had ever imagined. Success had stopped being a dream. It was now a rhythm, a schedule, a tax bracket. And with that came the strangest thing of all, options. One morning, in a loft apartment that smelled faintly of turpentine and overpriced coffee beans, I opened my laptop and saw an email subject line that made me choke on my croissant. Invitation, homecoming exhibition. It was from the local cultural committee of my hometown, the very same town where I had been dismissed, belittled, and politely exiled from family dinner conversations. They wanted me to headline an exhibition in the new municipal gallery. My name was in bold type, as if they suddenly remembered it belonged on banners instead of whispered disapproval. I stared at the screen and laughed so hard I spilled coffee on the rug. The irony was too rich. The same streets that once felt hostile now wanted to parade me as their golden child. Our success story, they'd say. Look at what our town produced. Produced? No, thank you. I produced myself, but I accepted. Of course I did. Revenge, my friends, is not always fire and fury. Sometimes it's hanging your $1,000,000 canvases under the same ceiling where your teachers once muttered that you'd never amount to much. When I arrived, the banner stretched across Main Street, my face printed larger than life. The mayor shook my hand as if we'd always been allies. Old neighbors brought casseroles and awkward smiles, and at the opening night I felt the room tremble with a kind of collective memory, like the town had woken from a dream where they'd always loved me. And then, there they were, my parents, standing near the entrance, stiff and cautious, like guests at a wedding they weren't sure they were invited to. My father wore the same jacket I remembered from years ago, slightly frayed at the cuffs. My mother's hair had gone silver, her eyes darting everywhere except at me. I don't know how to describe that moment except to say it felt like both lightning and silence struck at once. Every nerve in my body fired. I wanted to scream, laugh, collapse. Instead, I walked toward them slowly, like the protagonist in one of those overproduced dramas. We didn't hug, we didn't cry, not at first. My father cleared his throat, looked at the floor, and said, "Your work. It's impressive." My mother whispered, "We saw the reviews. It wasn't Shakespeare, but it was something." I replied with a joke, because humor has always been my armor. "Well, I guess cartoons on alley walls do pay off after all." That got a nervous laugh. The first crack in the wall. The night went on. Guests admired, critics scribbled, champagne flowed, and somewhere between the speeches and the flashbulbs, my parents and I sat quietly in a side room. They didn't say they were sorry, not yet. They didn't declare undying pride, but they stayed, they looked, they listened, and for the first time in decades we occupied the same space without the air turning toxic. Some historians still argue whether history bends toward justice. I can tell you sometimes it bends toward irony, and sometimes, if you're patient, it bends toward awkward reconciliation. That night, as the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, I carried something with me. Not closure, not forgiveness, but a fragile beginning. And honestly, that was enough. The months after the homecoming show unfolded like a strange dream, one where the past and present kept brushing shoulders, but never quite blending. My career kept accelerating. Articles in glossy magazines, interviews where I tried to look effortlessly thoughtful, commissions that demanded I think in bigger, bolder strokes. Yet between those flights and deadlines, I found myself on trains headed back to the small town I once swore I'd never see again. Each visit was tentative, like stepping onto thin ice. My parents and I weren't suddenly best friends, but we were at least acquaintances who shared a last name. We circled each other carefully, as though waiting for someone to break the silence with words heavier than "How's the weather?" or "Would you like more tea?" The house looked smaller than I remembered, the wallpaper still curling at the edges, the old clock ticking with stubborn regularity. Sometimes I'd notice the smell of old wood mixed with detergent, and feel a sudden ache, as if time itself was laughing at me for trying to outrun it. At dinners, my father would bring up local gossip: who sold their farm, whose son crashed his car. My mother would fuss over food, serving me twice as much as I could eat, as if to compensate for the years she hadn't fed me. And I would sit there, half amused, half incredulous, thinking, is this what healing looks like? Boring small talk and too much soup. And yet, beneath the mundanity, something shifted. One evening, as we sat in that cramped living room, my mother reached for my hand without saying a word. Her palm was warm, trembling slightly. My father cleared his throat and muttered, "We underestimated you." That was it. Not a novel, not a confession, just 4 words that cracked open decades of silence. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't redemption, but it was a beginning, and beginnings are rare gifts. Meanwhile, my art transformed again. Success no longer tasted like revenge. It began to taste like release. My canvases softened, more color, more light, fewer jagged edges. Critics called it the luminous phase, but I knew it was simply me, finally painting without the weight of proving anyone wrong. Still, humor kept me grounded. One day, when a journalist asked what my parents thought of my $1 million paintings, I deadpanned, "Oh, they're just relieved I'm not painting alley cartoons." The audience laughed, but inside, I smiled at the truth buried in the joke. Some historians argue whether reconciliation can ever be complete. I can tell you, it's less about erasing the past, and more about agreeing to live with its scars. My parents and I would never rewrite those lost years, but we could at least sketch something new over the cracks. And so, here I am, an artist, a daughter, a survivor of rejection, standing at the intersection of success and longing. My story isn't about perfect resolution, it's about messy persistence, about carrying pain and beauty in the same brushstroke, because in the end, revenge fades, applause quiets, critics move on. What remains are the colors you choose to live with, the scars you decide to turn into art, and the quiet hope that even the hardest hearts can soften, given time. And now, let's let the story drift into silence, like a painting fading gently in twilight. Imagine the gallery lights dimming, one by one, until the room is hushed, and the last echo of applause dissolves into air. The colors on the canvas soften, edges blur, and you find yourself leaning back, breathing slower, as though your own body has become part of the frame. The house is quiet now. The ticking clock fades, the clinking glasses are gone, and only the hum of memory remains. You're left with stillness, a soft kind of stillness that feels almost fragile, as if even a whisper might disturb it. The journey we walked together was never about revenge alone, or even triumph. It was about the winding paths of rejection and belonging, the ways scars can be gilded without vanishing, and the strange truth that healing rarely arrives in fireworks. Instead, it comes in small gestures, a letter, a trembling hand, a few halting words over soup. So, as you sink deeper into your pillow, let the images settle like dust in a sunlit room. The colors fade, the laughter softens, and what remains is just warmth, like a brushstroke of light across your cheek. Some stories end with thunder, this one ends with a sigh. And maybe that's enough, because sometimes, the quietest endings carry the most weight. So close your eyes, let your breath even out, and imagine yourself walking slowly through that dimming gallery, past canvases that no longer demand your attention. Step outside into the night air, cool and calm, and let it carry you gently, toward rest. Good night, my friend. Sleep well.